Hello everyone, hope everyone is doing well this weekend. In this video presentation, I'm going to talk about what is and when is the Sabbath. But before I begin, I want to put it out there that if anything that I'm saying and writing, I pray that the Most High God will stop it if it is not true. Now, this is in line with what the Pharisee Gamaliel said in behalf and in defense of the disciples preaching, and namely Paul and Silas. And we can read about that just briefly here at Acts chapter 5, verse 38 and 39. Here the Pharisee Gamaliel says to the high priest and the Sanhedrin, "Therefore, in the present case, I advise you, leave these men alone, let them go. For if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You'll only find yourselves fighting against God." So that is the view that I hold very strongly, and I'm humble enough to submit to God's will. And I pray to Him that if anything that I'm putting out here, or if I'm talking to individuals in public or in private, if what I'm saying is not true, I pray that He will stop it, stop what I'm saying, stop what I'm doing. Because I know that if it's not from Him, it is going to fail. And at the same time, I would ask Him for His correction, and I would humbly accept it. Such correction, if there is to be correction, is not going to come from human hands, because we as a species cannot be trusted. You see, we think we know it all. We are a very arrogant and lofty lot, and many among us think that we're even holy, that we can do no wrong, that we walk on water. That's not being humble. That's being a deity, a godlike one, and we're not. We're imperfect, and we are in need of being saved. Is the Sabbath day a Saturday, or is it a Sunday, or is it something much greater? Now, the first time we see anything to do with resting occurs here in Genesis chapter 2, verse 3. And there we read, "Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it He rested from all the work of creating that He had done." Now, if one reads the creation account in Genesis, one will learn that after each creative day, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, and day 6, after each of those days, God said, and the evening and the morning is that day, right? First, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth day. But with regards to the seventh day, God did not say, and the evening and the morning is the seventh day. Why is that? Well, two reasons. Number one, He rested from all the works that He had done previously, right? But the seventh day is not finished. We are currently in that seventh day. One must understand day from the standpoint of a time period, and not what we think day is. See, to us, a day is a 24-hour time period. But long ago, back then, when God was creating on the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth day, there was no person around. There wasn't a man around with a watch on his wrist, keeping time on what God was doing. No. So day in this aspect is a period of time that's on God's timetable and not ours. I believe that each creative day spanned many thousands of years, 6,000 or more years. I don't know. We don't know. But we do know that it was not a 24-hour day. That makes no sense. So I'm sure many of you have heard the expression that we use in conversations such as back in the day, or in the day of the horse and buggy, or in my grandfather's day. When we say those things, we're not referring to a literal 24-hour day, are we? No. We are referring to some unspecified period of time. So a day, each creative day long ago was an epoch or span of time, which was not 24 hours each. Okay, so please keep that in mind. And also keep in mind here that God rested from his works. But would we rest from ours? That's the question that we must answer, which leads into what is the Sabbath day and when is the Sabbath day. The word Sabbath comes from the Hebrew word Shabbath, which means to rest, to cease, or to desist. One must understand that the Sabbath was a part of the law covenant, which contained much more than the Ten Commandments. The law covenant that God gave Moses contained more than 600 laws. One of those was a law pertaining to the Sabbath. And that law covenant was an agreement, thus covenant, between the sons of Israel and God. And if we go to Exodus chapter 31, beginning at verse 16 and 17, we see that very clearly. Let's read that. The Israelites are to observe the Sabbath. The Israelites, celebrating it for the generations to come as a lasting covenant or agreement. It will be a sign between me, that's God, and the Israelites forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, like I just showed you. And on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. What one should glean from this is that this agreement, this covenant, was between the Israelites and God. No follower of Christ is under that agreement or covenant. Why is that? Because Christ had not come on the scene yet to even have followers. Now, if a person today believes that they are an Israelite and they believe that they must live by that law long ago, that's fine. But if a person becomes a disciple of Christ, then there's something they should know about. When Christ came on the scene, he said that I didn't come to abolish the law. I came to fulfill it. And also keep in mind that when Christ came on the scene, who did he come to? He came to his own people, the Jews. So he was talking to them. He said to them, I did not come to abolish the law. I've come to fulfill it. Why would Jesus say that to them? He was telling them that I didn't come to abolish God's law, but to fulfill it in your behalf because you were not able to keep it. And since you weren't able to keep it, you would die by it. Here's an analogy. Now, I've used this before. If you enter into a lease agreement, let's say to rent an apartment, a 12-month lease, and that's an agreement, covenant between you and the property owner. If either of you fail to live up to your end of that agreement, then what ensues is some type of penalty or punishment, eviction, or a lawsuit in the event that the property owner is found in default. So what Jesus was saying to the Jews in his day was that I didn't come to abolish that law that God had given to ancient Israel. I came to fulfill it in your behalf. So going back to that analogy with the lease agreement, let's say if you get 3 months behind in your rent, some good Samaritan or some good person comes along and settles, not only brings you current, pays up that 3 month behind you being in your rent, but also settles the entire 12-month lease agreement. So the lease agreement was still in effect. It didn't end. It's just someone came along and they settled it. They settled your debt. They settled that agreement. They fulfilled that lease agreement for you. That's what that means. So that Christ followers, those who become his disciples, you see, the first ones to become his disciples were Jews. If we go to John chapter 8 from verse 31 and 32, Jesus says there, to the Jews who had believed him, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. What would them knowing the truth set them free from? It would set them free from keeping that burdensome law. Like I used the analogy, a person comes along and they settles a person's lease agreement. So because they couldn't keep it, they got 3 months behind in their rent, for example. So Jesus set them free, but they would first have to become his disciples. And that's what it says here. If you hold to my teaching, You are really my disciples, then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. They will be set free from that old law. Now, whether a person is a Jew or Gentile who becomes a follower of Christ, they are not under that old law. How do we know that? Well, if you go to Romans chapter 10, verse 4, we have a Jew here speaking, the Apostle Paul, a very devout Jew. What does he say? He says, Christ is the culmination of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. And Jesus even said that back here at John chapter 8, verse 31, to the Jews who had believed him. So the Apostle Paul is in full agreement with his master. If we go to Romans chapter 7, verses 6 and 7, the Apostle Paul again is speaking. He says, but now, by dying to what once bound us, what once bound them, the Jews, the Mosaic law or the law covenant, we have been released from the law. I'm going to repeat that because many don't want to see this, but that's what it says. We have been released from the law so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit, and not in the old way of the written code. What's the old way and what's that written code? The old way is the law covenant. Verse 7, what shall we say then? Is the law sinful? No, the law isn't sinful. The law is perfect. The law reveals sin. Nevertheless, I would not have known what sin was had it not been for the law. So the law had to come to reveal that we are imperfect. Only a perfect person could keep a perfect law. And since we're all imperfect, there's no way that we could keep that perfect law. So it revealed that we are imperfect and we are sinners. And as Paul says here, for I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had not said, you shall not covet. So glean from this that those who are followers of Christ, we are not under that law. And that law wasn't given to us anyway. It was given to the Jews. And again, remember, when Christ came on the scene, he went to his people first, the Jews. The 12 apostles they chose were all Jews. So God sent him to the Jews first, the Gentiles second. Go to Galatians chapter 4, beginning at verse 9 through 11. It reads, but now that you know God, or rather are known by God, that's important, that God knows you. How is it that you are turning back to those weak and miserable forces? What were those weak and miserable forces? That old way. Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? You see, Christ had come on the scene and he turned them around. He had already told them that I didn't come to abolish the law, but I came to fulfill it in your behalf. And then after he's gone, now there was some trying to turn back and going back to those old ways, as if God sending his son was for naught. And so that's why Paul would say, do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? You are observing special days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that somehow I have wasted my efforts on you. Many today do not want to hear this. In a previous video, I said to you guys that I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear, but I'm showing you here what it says here. Now, I'm fully aware that there are many who believe that you got to keep the commandments. What commandments are they talking about? Most people are talking about those old commandments, the old ways, commandments that weren't even given to them themselves. And if you are a follower of Christ, whether you are a Jew who became his disciple or a Gentile who became his disciple, you are not under that old law. The Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 10, verse 4, Christ is the culmination of the law. And we were right here at Galatians chapter 4, verse 9 through 11. And here the Apostle Paul is admonishing the congregation here in Galatia that I fear for you, that somehow I've wasted my efforts on you. Many people are not listening, stubborn, headstrong, believing something that's no longer in effect. If you go to Colossians chapter 2, verse 13 and 16, we read there, and the Apostle Paul speaking here too, when you were dead in your sins and in the circumcision of your flesh, God made you alive in who? The law? No, he made you alive in Christ. He forgave us all our sins, having did what? Canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness. That was the law covenant. He canceled it. He settled that debt in their behalf, which stood against us and condemned us. The law covenant condemned those who tried to keep it. And as I mentioned earlier, the law covenant was a perfect law. It would have been impossible for imperfect men then and now to keep that law. It would stand against them and it would condemn them. If they tried to live by it, they would die by it. They would be condemned by the law. And we're told here that he, that's Jesus, has taken it away, nailing it to the cross. And having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. Go over to Hebrews chapter 4, verses 9 and 11. This is interesting. And here again, the Apostle Paul is speaking. He says, "There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his." See, so God rested from his works by the Sabbath day. So we are to rest from ours. That's our Sabbath. And there's a deep meaning there, and I'm about to explain that to you. Verse 11, "Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience." In other words, we ourselves determining what is good and bad, what is obedient and what is disobedient. So what is the Sabbath? The Sabbath is a ceasing of doing our own will, see, and working to do God's will. In other words, joining Christ in doing God's will. Why is that? Because God rested by the seventh day. The seventh day is not finished. Jesus called himself the Lord of the Sabbath. Why is that? Because he has been appointed by God as the finisher of the seventh day. So that when it comes to its conclusion, then God will say, "And the evening and the morning is the seventh day." So we join Christ. I join my master in the doing of his will, that is God's will, and resting from doing my own will. My will is to do what Christ is doing. So we are to join Christ in doing God's will and finishing and seeing to the completion the seventh day. So that transitions into when is the seventh day. The seventh day is not a 24-hour time period. It is not a Saturday and it is not a Sunday. It is a time period. We are currently in that day. Each and every day that we wake up into that Sabbath day. So is one to say that, let's say if one does believe that Saturday and Sunday is a Sabbath day and they celebrate that. What is that? That's a ritual. Are they saying that they only do good things on a Saturday or a Sunday? That makes no sense. We are to do God's will each and every day in this time period until it's brought to a conclusion. Now, if we go over to Mark chapter 2, verse 27, we read there, "Then he said to them," this is Jesus, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. We are in a time period called the Lord's Day. That doesn't mean that Christ has been given his kingdom of 1,000 years over the earth. That's something totally different. It's that God has appointed him as Lord over this time period because he is the one who is going to complete the task and the work that his Father has given him to do. That involves restoring us, imperfect human beings, to perfection and bringing us before our Creator one-to-one, perfect, just as Adam was one-to-one. Adam didn't have a Christ. Adam didn't have intermediator. Adam was a perfect man. So one of those tasks that Christ will fulfill in this 7-day period, and what I'm about to say is yet future, that is restoring us to our Creator. destroying the adversary once and for all, Satan the devil, making the entire earth a paradise where everyone will prosper and benefit under one government, God's kingdom. No more human rule. I should also mention here that when God rested by the seventh day, did he give Adam a command to keep some day of the week, some 24-hour period of the week? No. Think about that. Let's go over to Luke chapter 14, verse 1. And this is interesting because Jesus here is showing that the Sabbath day is not a 24-hour day. Check it out. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being watched carefully. There in front of him was a man suffering from abnormal swelling of his body. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the law, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. So taking hold of the man, that's Jesus, he healed him and sent him on his way. Then he asked these Pharisees, "If one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out?" Wow. Talk about checkmate. What is this teaching us? That we don't choose one day out of the week to do good. Each and every day in our lives, we look to do good. And even more importantly, look to do the ultimate good, that is doing God's will and resting, ceasing, desisting from doing our own. We join Christ in doing God's will and in seeing the conclusion of the seventh day. So one day God will say, and the evening and the morning is the seventh day. Okay, so hopefully that answers the questions, that the Sabbath day is not a 24-hour time period, and that it was a part of the law covenant that followers of Christ are not under, and that the seventh day is a time period. It is not a 24-hour span of time. We are currently in that time period of the seventh day. This is R. Jerome Harris. Thank you for listening.